It was a cool April afternoon in 2025. The campus of Georgetown University buzzed with anticipation. You could feel it in the air. Something big was about to happen. Students lined the hallways. Press cameras were being set up, and the main auditorium was packed to the brim. Today wasn't just another guest lecture. It was billed as a global dialogue on youth and leadership, a prestigious event that brought together rising political minds and world leaders to talk about the future. And right at the center of it all was a name no one expected to see on the event flyer: Baron Trump. Now 19 years old and studying international relations, Baron had grown tall like his father, but carried himself with a quiet intensity he'd been working hard to refine. This wasn't the flashy kid the media once portrayed. He wore a tailored navy suit, a sharp red tie, and the unmistakable look of someone with something to prove. Backstage, he checked his notes one last time and turned to his roommate. "This is it," he whispered. "I'm not just Trump's kid anymore. I have my own voice." And while the crowd inside waited for the event to begin, halfway across the world in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, another figure was preparing for the same moment. President Ibrahim Traoré, just 36 years old, known for his blunt honesty and unshakable calm, had agreed to join the debate via livestream. But what no one knew was, he had a reason for saying yes. Word had reached his office that a Trump family member would be participating, and that piqued his interest. Inside the auditorium, Dr. Sarah Chen, a well-respected political science professor, stepped up to the podium. "Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Leadership Dialogue. We're honored to host Georgetown student Baron Trump, and joining us virtually from Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traoré." Applause echoed across the room. Then the lights dimmed slightly as a massive screen behind the stage lit up. President Traoré appeared. Seated at his desk, the Burkina Faso flag draped neatly behind him. Dr. Chen smiled. "Our topic today: young leadership and global responsibility. Baron, would you like to begin?" He stood confidently. His voice was smooth. "Thank you, Professor Chen. I believe young leaders have a duty to challenge outdated systems, especially when those systems have failed to deliver real results. Too often, we hear calls for change from leaders in developing countries, and when we look closer, what do we see? Just younger versions of the same old failures." It was subtle, but in the room it hit hard. The provocation was clear. On the screen, President Traoré gave a quiet smile. Not the friendly kind. The kind his staff had learned to recognize, the kind that meant something was coming. And just like that, the debate was no longer academic. It was personal. Baron Trump stood tall at the podium, scanning the sea of faces in the auditorium. The lights reflected off his polished shoes, but he didn't flinch. He had prepared for this moment. This was his chance to step out of the long shadow of his last name and into his own spotlight. He adjusted his mic and began. "Young leaders," he said, "have a responsibility not just to participate, but to challenge the systems that failed generations before us." A few heads in the room nodded. It was a confident start. "But here's the problem," Baron continued. "Too often, especially in so-called developing nations, we hear passionate speeches about change, grand promises, loud declarations. But when you dig a little deeper, it's all noise, just younger faces running the same broken systems." The crowd stirred. He glanced just briefly at the large screen behind him, where President Ibrahim Traoré appeared, listening silently from his office in Burkina Faso. Baron let the moment hang in the air. "It's easy," he added, "to play the hero when there's no scoreboard, no accountability, just words." His delivery was smooth, calculated, but the implication was crystal clear. Every person in that room knew who those words were aimed at. On the screen, President Traoré didn't move right away. His posture remained relaxed, his hands folded calmly on the desk in front of him. But then, The corner of his mouth lifted just slightly. Dr. Sarah Chen, sensing the tension, turned to the monitor. President Traoré, would you care to respond? He leaned forward slowly, his voice calm and unshaken. Thank you, Professor Chen. It's always enlightening to hear young voices from privileged backgrounds speak on global leadership. The word privileged landed like a pin drop in a silent room. Some students exchanged glances. Barron kept a firm smile, but his jaw clenched ever so slightly. Traoré continued, Mr. Trump is right about one thing: young leaders must challenge the status quo. But the real question is, are we doing it to change lives or just to make noise? And with that, the air changed. You could feel it. Barron had thrown the first stone, but President Traoré had just responded with a chess move. Barron didn't flinch, at least not outwardly. But something in President Traoré's tone had shifted the mood in the room. It wasn't loud, it wasn't angry, but it carried weight. That kind of quiet confidence that doesn't need to raise its voice to be heard. I agree with Mr. Trump, Traoré said. The status quo must be challenged. He leaned in slightly, still calm, still collected. But challenge means action. It means change you can measure. Not just slogans at university forums or quotes rehearsed from textbooks. Some students sat up straighter. Others began pulling out their phones, not to scroll, but to record. They sensed it, too. And when we talk about leadership, Traoré continued, we must ask, is it rooted in experience, in results, or in entitlement? Barron tilted his head, pretending to look thoughtful. But the word entitlement echoed louder than anything else in the room. President Traoré paused just long enough for the silence to say something. I was 34 when I took office, he said. Not much older than Mr. Trump is now. And when I stepped into leadership, my country was fractured. Our economy devastated. Our people tired of promises. He glanced down, opened a small folder in front of him, but didn't look at it just yet. And yes, Mr. Trump, he added, there was plenty of room for improvement. Barron gave a tight smile. He thought that line might land in his favor. But Traoré wasn't finished. And that's exactly what we've been doing: improving. Quietly, steadily, without the luxury of global media, billion-dollar foundations, or last names that open every door. The contrast was subtle, but sharp. The auditorium was completely still. Barron tapped his fingers lightly against the podium, trying to hold his composure. But the energy was shifting. Fast. President Traoré gave one final glance toward the camera. I've always believed, he said, that real leadership is proven by what you build, not by what you inherit. And just like that, the power in the room moved. Not with a shout, not with a scandal, but with a single, undeniable truth. Barron had come to Georgetown to lead a conversation. But now, he was on the receiving end of a masterclass. Barron Trump wasn't used to being on the defensive, not in debates, not in classrooms, and definitely not in public. But for the first time, his well-rehearsed confidence began to slip. Still, he didn't back down. President Traoré, he said with a forced smile, with all due respect, it's a lot easier to talk about improvement when your starting point is that far behind. You're governing a country that, let's be honest, a long way to go. Gasps rippled through the room. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it. Like he was punching down. Traoré didn't flinch, didn't blink. He simply opened the folder in front of him and pulled out a page. Well then, he said calmly, since we're talking about progress, let's look at a few numbers. I think you, Mr. Trump, with your background in international relations, might appreciate this. Barron straightened his back. When I took office, Traoré said, 47% of my people lived in extreme poverty. Today, just 3 years later, that number is down to 23%. That's a 51% reduction. He paused, letting the weight of the statistics sink in. Literacy rates have nearly doubled. Access to clean drinking water has gone from 42 to 78%. GDP per capita up by 39%. No dramatics, no shouting, just facts. Now, he continued, these improvements didn't come from privilege or legacy. They came from hard choices, from discipline, from listening to the people. Barron swallowed hard. Mr. Trump, Traoré said, locking eyes through the camera, these are the outcomes from a nation rebuilding itself after decades of instability, and yet these are the results we've delivered. The auditorium was silent. So let me ask you a simple question, Traoré continued. In your 19 years of life outside of being born into wealth and fame, what results have you delivered? Barron opened his mouth, but no words came out. I'm studying, he finally said. Studying is good, Traoré replied, his tone still gentle. But when you publicly question the work of others, it helps to bring results of your own. And in that moment, Barron Trump realized something. This wasn't just a debate. This was a reckoning. Barron tried to hide it, but the shift in his body language was obvious. His shoulders stiffened, his eyes darted. The confident smirk was gone, replaced by a forced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. President Traoré, still seated calmly on the big screen, leaned back for a moment, then slowly reached for a second folder. This one looked different. If we're going to talk about leadership and integrity, Traoré said, perhaps it's time we address not just results, but character. Barron froze. Over the past year, Traoré continued, my intelligence services have received interesting reports. Now, some may be surprised that an African nation has capable intelligence services, but we do. The audience let out a nervous laugh. Traoré didn't. According to multiple sources, Mr. Trump, he said, you've attended private political mixism hosted off-campus where substances were present. Substances that, let's say, don't typically show up on a class syllabus. Barron's face tightened. And these substances, Traoré added, were purchased at least once using a credit card linked to your family's private accounts. Whispers swept across the room like a windstorm. Dr. Chen leaned forward, concerned. President Traoré, are you certain of these claims? I wouldn't share them here if I weren't, he said, his voice firm but measured. But this is not about drugs or privilege. This is about patterns. Because what's more alarming is what was said during those gatherings. Barron looked visibly pale now. A sheen of sweat began forming on his forehead. You see, Traoré said, in one of those private discussions, you reportedly spoke of using your last name to fast-track political internships. Not because of merit, but because, quote, it's time for real Americans to take back the system. The quote landed like a hammer. Barron shook his head, stammering, "Two don't know what you're talking about." You don't? Traoré asked. That's curious, because we have photos, we have transcripts, we have recordings. Barron's lips parted, but nothing came out. This was no longer a debate. It was a spotlight. And Barron Trump, who came here to define his future, was suddenly trying to outrun his past. The room was no longer curious, it was tense. Barron's palms were now visibly sweating. He adjusted his tie, but his fingers fumbled. The calm, confident student who opened the debate was quickly unraveling. And President Traoré hadn't even gotten to the worst part yet. He opened the folder once more, this time slow and deliberate. Mr. Trump, he said, since you raised concerns about leaders who speak loudly but lack substance, I'd like to share something we uncovered during our investigation. Barron leaned slightly forward, as if bracing for impact. These, Traoré continued, are audio recordings. Recordings made during your private conversations, some captured at parties, others in dorm rooms. These are your words, and they speak louder than any policy paper or campaign slogan ever could. Barron shook his head, whispering, No, this can't be real. President Traoré didn't blink. In one clip, dated the 23rd of March, He said, "You're heard referring to people of African descent in language I will not repeat in this academic setting. But let me summarize. You questioned their intelligence. You spoke of primitive minds. You mocked efforts toward independence and dignity." A collective gasp filled the room. Several students turned to each other, their expressions turning from confusion to disgust. Barron's lips trembled. "That wasn't me," he said. "I'm afraid the voice analysis says otherwise," Traoré replied calmly. "We confirmed with third-party experts. It's undeniably yours." "And if that's not enough," he added, "on the 2nd of April, you were recorded discussing your strategy to gain political power without, quote, working with these losers who actually earned it." Barron tried to interrupt, but Traoré's tone sharpened just slightly. "Let me finish," he said, "because what you said on the 18th of March is something every person in this room deserves to hear." Barron stood frozen. "You spoke of again, I quote, cleansing American politics of minorities who don't understand how the world really works." Silence. Thick. Heavy. The kind of silence that screams louder than any microphone. Barron opened his mouth, but no words came out. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped. Then President Traoré looked straight into the camera. "Mr. Trump," he said, "would you like to explain those statements to your classmates?" Barron stared back cornered, exposed, and utterly alone. Barron Trump's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His eyes were wide now, not with confidence, but panic. The kind of panic that sets in when the mask slips and there's no way to put it back on. "Tu didn't mean it like that," he stammered. "This is all taken out of context." But Traoré didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "Context?" he repeated gently. "You called people inferior. You mocked the struggles of entire continents. You spoke of power as if it were a family inheritance. What context makes that acceptable?" Barron's breath quickened. This is illegal," he snapped. "You can't use private recordings." The moderator, Professor Chen, tried to intervene. "Mr. Trump, please." But Barron was spiraling. "You don't understand," he shouted. "My father, he's running again. You can't treat me like this." The audience recoiled. Some students looked genuinely shocked. Others began pulling out their phones again, capturing the moment. "This is a setup," Barron yelled, now pacing. "You think you've ruined me? You have no idea who I am." President Traoré watched, unflinching. "Mr. Trump," he said calmly, "I think we all know who you are now." Barron's voice cracked as he pointed toward the screen. You're nobody. You're from a country no one even talks about." And there it was. The mask didn't slip this time, it shattered. The room fell into a stunned silence. Even students who had once been curious now stared in disbelief. Traoré remained composed, his hands still folded on his desk. "You speak of global leadership," he said, "but can't handle accountability on a university stage. You want power, but reject responsibility. That, Mr. Trump, is not leadership. That is privilege unchecked." Barron looked around, as if searching for a way out. But the walls weren't closing in. His own words were. And in that moment, the truth became painfully clear, not just to the crowd, but to Barron himself. He hadn't come here to lead a conversation. He'd walked straight into a mirror. And what stared back was a version of himself he could no longer control. Barron's voice rose again, but this time, it was ragged and desperate. "You don't know what you're doing," he shouted toward the back of the room. "This Afrikaner is lying. My father will destroy all of you." And with that one sentence, the last thread of control snapped. You could hear gasps. A few students even stood up. No one moved toward him, but everyone backed away. Professor Chen motioned discreetly to the side of the room, where two campus security officers were already approaching. "Mr. Trump," one said calmly, "we need you to come with us." Barron shook his head violently. "Don't touch me," You can't treat me like this. I'm a Trump. But the officers weren't aggressive. They weren't even firm. They just stood, waiting, letting him burn out his own energy. We know who you are, one replied quietly. And we know you need help. Barron began pacing in circles on stage, his words turning into a string of incoherent mutterings. The audience sat frozen, unsure if they were witnessing a meltdown or a public unraveling of something far deeper. Back on the screen, President Traoré sat still, watching the scene unfold. Finally, he leaned toward the mic. Professor Chen, he said gently, I believe it's time we bring this session to a close. Mr. Trump clearly needs privacy and professional support. Chen nodded. Thank you, President Traoré. We appreciate your candor and your presence today. Before the live stream ended, Traoré offered one last message to the room. Leadership, he said, is not about titles or last names. It is about humility, accountability, and the courage to change when faced with truth. I hope today is remembered not as a scandal but as a lesson. And then, the screen went dark. Barron, now breathing heavily and mumbling under his breath, was guided gently off stage by the guards as emergency medical staff arrived. Students whispered to one another, phones still recording, eyes wide with disbelief. One voice echoed from the back of the room. I came to hear a debate, not witness a downfall. But that's exactly what they'd seen. Not just the fall of a name, but the collapse of a persona built on entitlement, unraveling in real time for the whole world to see. The moment Barron Trump was escorted out of the Georgetown auditorium, the internet ignited. Clips of the collapse, highs shouting, the accusations, the recordings spread like wildfire across every platform imaginable. Within an hour, the hashtag number Barron Meltdown was trending globally. 3 million mentions. And counting. Every angle was caught on camera. Students had recorded it from their phones, news crews picked it up immediately, and within minutes, the story hit the headlines. Barron Trump removed from Georgetown event after public breakdown. Racist recordings spark outrage, university launches investigation. Student or symbol. The collapse of a political heir. Meanwhile, in a quiet wing of Georgetown University Hospital, Barron lay sedated. His hands still trembled, and even under medical care, he kept muttering the same phrase again and again. They don't understand. My father will sue all of them. The attending psychiatrist, Dr. Rodriguez, took careful notes. In her evaluation, she wrote, patient displays signs of severe entitlement, dissociation from reality, and escalating paranoia under pressure. Back at the university, an emergency meeting was already underway. Faculty, administrators, and legal advisors gathered behind closed doors. He violated multiple codes of conduct, said the dean of students. Hate speech, threatening behavior, disruption of a university event. He needs help, someone added. And he's getting it, another replied. But the university still has to take a position. The conclusion was swift and unanimous. Barron Trump was placed on indefinite suspension from Georgetown University, pending full review. Across the country, the ripple effects reached even farther. In Florida, at the Trump family estate, a senior advisor approached the former president with a grave face. Sir, he said quietly, we have a problem. It's about Barron. Trump stared, unmoved. What kind of problem? Videos. Recordings. He's had a breakdown. There's media coverage everywhere. Silence. Then, a long, cold sigh. How bad? Bad, the advisor said. Very bad. The story had broken containment. It wasn't just a campus incident anymore. It was a national narrative. And for the Trump family, a brand built on control, confidence, and dominance, this wasn't just a PR disaster. It was a fracture. One that couldn't be polished, spun, or bought away. The days that followed weren't a slow news cycle, they were a media storm. Barron Trump's name was everywhere. Not in celebration, not in admiration, but as a cautionary tale. Georgetown University confirmed the suspension. The official statement read, "We do not tolerate hate speech, abusive behavior, or threats within our academic community, regardless of a student's background or family name." But behind the headlines, the truth hit harder than the press could print. The recordings were real. The voice was verified. And the person who leaked them? It was someone Barron trusted completely, his own roommate, Eric Davidson. In a quiet interview with the Washington Post, Eric explained why he did it. "At first, I just thought he was arrogant," he said. "But then, he started saying things that didn't sound like someone just venting. They sounded dangerous, entitled, racist, like someone planning to use power, not to serve, but to dominate." Asked why he recorded it, Eric didn't hesitate. Because no one would believe it unless they heard it for themselves. Across social media, reaction was swift and fierce. Some defended Barron, calling him a kid who cracked under pressure. But most saw it differently. As one post read, "It wasn't a collapse. It was exposure." In Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traoré gave one final interview, this time with the BBC. When asked if he regretted being so direct with a young man, he answered firmly, 19 is young. But 19 is not too young to know right from wrong. If someone intends to lead, they must be ready to answer for their beliefs." And then he added a final thought that echoed around the world. "Silence in the face of prejudice is complicity. I chose not to be silent." Barron Trump remained in private psychiatric care. No official word from the family. No public apology. Just silence. But the damage had already been done. A legacy undone by arrogance. A reputation shattered by truth. And a young man who learned too late that privilege might open doors, but it can't protect you from the consequences of your own words. And in the end, that's what this story became. Not about scandal, not about politics, but about the simple truth. Character matters, even when no one's watching.